The first thing I noticed about the village was the silence. No birds, no wind, no sunlight. And the second thing I noticed was that every single window in town was nailed shut from the inside.
Welcome to Horror Audiobook.
Tonight's story is about a place that shouldn't exist. A forgotten mountain village where the sun never rises, where the streets fall silent after dusk, and where every door is locked long before night arrives. A traveler wanders into this town by accident, only to discover the people living there aren't afraid of the darkness. They're afraid of what moves inside it. Because in this village, the night doesn't just fall. It hunts, and once the darkness notices you, it never stops watching. Chapter 1. The map said the village didn't exist. The mountain road had not been on any map. Daniel Mercer knew that with certainty. He had checked twice before leaving the last gas station 2 hours earlier, unfolding the creased paper map across the hood of his car while cold wind pushed through the pines. The highway cut cleanly through the mountains, one long gray vein stretching between two distant towns. There were no other roads, no forks, no villages. And yet somehow he had taken one. The mistake happened quietly. A narrow gravel path had appeared between two walls of trees while he was driving through a bank of fog. It looked almost natural, like a forgotten service road carved into the mountain decades earlier. Daniel barely noticed turning onto it. But 20 minutes later, he began to feel something unsettling creeping into the pit of his stomach. The road did not end. It only climbed higher. The forest thickened around him. Pine branches leaned over the narrow trail like fingers trying to touch the roof of his car. Fog gathered between the trunks. The deeper he drove, the quieter the world became. No birds, no wind, no distant hum of highways. Just the low grind of tires against gravel and the occasional snap of branches beneath them. Daniel slowed the car. He glanced at the GPS mounted to his dashboard. The screen had frozen. A gray grid blinked faintly where the map should have been. No signal, the device read. He frowned. Mountain roads often killed reception. That wasn't unusual. Still, something about the silence outside the car felt wrong. Oppressive. Like the forest itself was holding its breath. He rolled the window down slightly. Cold air slipped inside. But even that air carried no scent of life. No pine. No damp soil. Just a dry, empty chill. Daniel reached for the folded map on the passenger seat and glanced at it again. The highway was clearly marked. The mountains, the lakes, even the smallest towns. But the road he was on simply didn't exist. He laughed quietly to himself. Probably an old logging trail. The explanation sounded reasonable enough. Still, unease lingered. Some places are hidden for a reason. The thought slipped into his mind without warning. Daniel shook his head. Just a road, he muttered. But he kept driving. 40 minutes later, the trees suddenly ended. The fog parted, and Daniel Mercer saw the village. At first, he thought the dim shapes ahead were ruins. A scattering of buildings slouched along a crooked dirt street. Their wooden walls were warped with age, paint peeled away by years of mountain storms. A leaning water tower stood near the edge of town. A rusted truck sat abandoned beside a collapsed fence. The entire place looked forgotten, but not abandoned. Lights glowed faintly behind a few windows. Weak yellow lights, the kind that came from old bulbs struggling against failing electricity. Daniel slowed the car until it crawled along the road. He scanned the buildings carefully. No signs. No welcome boards. No gas stations. Just houses. Old ones. The architecture looked decades out of place. Simple wooden structures with narrow porches and sagging roofs. A church steeple rose above the far end of town. Its bell tower leaned slightly to one side. Daniel parked beside the road and turned off the engine. The silence returned instantly. Deeper now. He stepped out of the car. Gravel crunched beneath his boots. The sky above the village made him pause. It wasn't dark, but it wasn't daylight either. The clouds overhead glowed with a dull gray color, like the sun was trapped somewhere far behind them. It reminded Daniel of the strange light that appears just before a storm. Except, the sky wasn't moving. There were no shifting clouds, no changing colors, just the same endless gray twilight. Daniel checked his watch. 4:17 p.m. Plenty of daylight left. Yet the village felt like evening had already fallen. A faint breeze stirred the dust along the street. Somewhere in the distance, a wooden sign creaked slowly. He began walking. Every step echoed louder than it should have. The first house he passed had boarded windows, thick planks nailed across the glass from the inside. The next house looked the same. And the next. Daniel frowned. Why would anyone board their windows from inside? Another step. Another house. More boards. Then he noticed something else. Movement. A figure standing on a porch. An old man, thin as a fence post. The man didn't speak. He didn't wave. He simply watched. Daniel raised a hand in greeting. Afternoon. The old man didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on Daniel with a strange intensity. Another door opened further down the street. A woman stepped outside. Then another. And another. Soon Daniel realized the entire street was filling with silent figures watching him. Men. Women. Even children. No one spoke. No one smiled. They simply observed him as if he had stepped into a place he should never have found. Daniel forced a polite smile. "Sorry to bother you folks," he said. "I think I might have taken a wrong turn somewhere." Still silence. The villagers stared as though weighing something invisible. Daniel shifted awkwardly. "Is there a road back to the highway?" No answer. Finally, the old man on the porch spoke. His voice sounded brittle. "You came through the mountain road." It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, gravel path through the trees." The old man's eyes darkened slightly. "Then you're already too far." Daniel laughed uneasily. "Too far for what?" The old man didn't respond. Instead, he asked a different question. One that made Daniel's stomach tighten. "How long are you planning to stay?" Daniel blinked. "Stay." He gestured toward the road behind him. "I'm just passing through." The villagers exchanged quiet glances. A woman standing beside a doorway shook her head slowly. The old man stepped down from his porch. "You should come inside before dark." Daniel glanced at the sky again. "But it's not even evening." The old man followed his gaze upward. His expression grew heavy. "It will be." He turned and began walking toward the nearest house. Daniel hesitated. The street behind him stretched back toward the forest, toward the road he had driven in on. He decided to leave. "Thanks," Daniel called. "But I should get going." He walked back to the car and opened the door. The villagers didn't stop him. They simply watched. Daniel started the engine and turned the car around. The tires rolled slowly toward the road leading back into the forest. But when he reached the edge of town, he stopped. The road was gone. Where the gravel path had once cut through the trees, there was now nothing but dense forest. Pine trunks stood shoulder to shoulder like a wall. No tire tracks. No clearing. No road. Just trees. Daniel stepped out of the car slowly. His breath fogged in the cold air. He walked forward and pushed aside a low branch. More trees. More darkness. No path. Behind him, the villagers still stood along the street. Watching. Waiting. Daniel felt a chill crawl along his spine. He turned toward them. The old man spoke again, his voice barely louder than the wind. Some places are hidden for a reason. Daniel stared at the forest, then back at the silent village. And for the first time, he wondered if he had just driven into a place that the world was never meant to find. Behind him, somewhere deep in the trees, something moved. Chapter 2. Every window was sealed from the inside. Daniel Mercer stood at the edge of the forest for a long time. The trees looked ordinary enough, tall pines stretching into the dim gray sky, their needles whispering softly in a breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. But the longer he stared, the more unsettling the forest became. There was no break in the trees. No gravel. No tire tracks. Nothing. It was as if the road he had driven in on had simply never existed. Behind him, the villagers were still watching. Daniel turned slowly. Their eyes followed him with quiet intensity, not curiosity, not hostility either. Something closer to expectation. Like they had seen this moment many times before. Daniel forced a smile. Okay, this is strange. No one laughed. The old man who had spoken earlier stepped forward again. His movements were slow, careful, like someone who had learned to conserve energy in a place where time moved differently. You should come inside, he repeated. Daniel glanced at the sky again. The same dull gray twilight hung overhead. What time does it get dark here? Daniel asked. The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the mountains surrounding the village. It already has. Daniel frowned. That doesn't make sense. A woman near the porch of the nearest house spoke quietly. You'll understand soon enough. Her voice carried a tired weight that made Daniel uneasy. He looked back toward the forest again. Still no road. Still no way out. Some places are hidden for a reason. The phrase surfaced in his mind again. Daniel sighed. Fine, he muttered. For now. The house they led him into smelled faintly of dust and wood smoke. The interior was dim, lit by a few old lamps placed carefully along the walls. Thick curtains covered every window, layered in heavy fabric that blocked even the faint gray light outside. Daniel noticed something else immediately. Wooden planks. They were nailed across the inside of every window frame. Not casually either. Each board was thick, reinforced with rusted nails hammered deep into the wood. Daniel stepped closer to one of the windows. Storm damage? He asked. The old man shook his head. No. Daniel ran his fingers along one of the planks. The wood felt rough and worn, as though it had been handled many times. When were these put up? Years ago. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That's a lot of effort just to block windows. The old man didn't respond. Instead, he moved across the room and quietly locked the front door. Not just once. 3 heavy locks slid into place. Then he dragged a thick iron bar across the doorframe. Daniel stared. Okay, he said slowly. Now I'm curious. The old man motioned for him to sit at a wooden table. My name is Elias. Daniel sat cautiously. Daniel. Elias nodded. You drove into the village by accident. Yeah, Daniel said. Seems that way. The old man studied him carefully. You didn't know where the road led. Nope. You didn't see the signs. Daniel frowned. What signs? Elias looked disappointed. That's what I feared. Daniel leaned forward. What signs? But Elias didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the curtained window. The room had grown darker without Daniel noticing. The gray light outside had dimmed slightly, turning the curtains into dull silhouettes. Daniel checked his watch again. 4:52 p.m. It felt like midnight. Outside, faint sounds echoed through the village. Doors closing. Wood sliding. Metal locks clicking into place. Daniel turned toward the window again. Why is everyone shutting themselves in? Elias spoke quietly. Because the sun is almost gone. Daniel pointed toward the curtains. It's already dark. Elias nodded. Yes, but it will get worse. Daniel laughed softly. Look, I appreciate the hospitality, but you're all acting like something terrible happens at night. Elias said nothing. From another room, an elderly woman appeared carrying a small lantern. She placed it gently on the table. Her hands trembled slightly. Daniel noticed the same fear in her eyes that he had seen in the others outside. He leaned back in the chair. All right, he said. What exactly are we hiding from? The old woman spoke before Elias could answer. The dark. Daniel smiled politely. That's poetic. She shook her head slowly. No. Her voice lowered. Literal. Daniel opened his mouth to respond. Then he noticed something strange. The room had grown colder. Not gradually. Suddenly. Like a door somewhere had been opened to winter. The lantern flame flickered. Elias stood abruptly. It's happening sooner tonight. He walked quickly toward the windows. Daniel heard the sound then. Faint. Distant. A slow dragging noise outside. Like something heavy being pulled across dirt. Daniel leaned toward the curtain. What is that? Elias grabbed his arm. Don't. Daniel looked at him. Why? Elias' eyes were filled with something deeper than fear. Experience. Because once you see it, he whispered, it sees you. Daniel pulled his arm free. You're being ridiculous. He stepped closer to the curtain. The fabric shifted slightly as wind brushed the outside wall. The dragging sound came again. Closer now. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. His hand reached toward the curtain. Elias spoke again. More urgently this time. Please. Daniel hesitated. The old woman whispered something under her breath. A prayer. The dragging sound stopped. Complete silence swallowed the village. Daniel froze. Outside the window. Something moved. A shadow passed across the curtain. Huge. Wrong. Not the shape of a person. Not the shape of any animal Daniel had ever seen. Just a shifting darkness sliding across the wall. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The lantern flickered violently. Elias whispered something that made Daniel's stomach drop. It's early tonight. Daniel forced a laugh. That's just someone walking past. But Elias slowly shook his head. No one walks outside after dark. Daniel glanced back at the curtain. The shadow was gone. The dragging sound returned. Moving further down the street. Slow. Patient. Daniel stepped away from the window. His voice came out quieter than he expected. What was that? Elias stared at the door. Listening. Waiting. Then he answered. "We seal the windows," he said slowly, "because whatever walks out there." He paused. The dragging sound faded into the distance. The old man finally finished the sentence. "Likes to look inside." The lantern flame trembled. Outside, somewhere deeper in the village, a church bell rang once, and every person in the house went completely still. Chapter 3. The sun never rises here anymore. The bell rang only once. A deep, hollow sound that rolled through the village like a distant thunderclap. Then the silence returned. Daniel sat frozen at the table, staring toward the door as if something might burst through it at any moment. The lantern's weak flame trembled between them, throwing warped shadows across the wooden walls. No one spoke. Not Elias. Not the old woman. Not even Daniel. The sound outside had disappeared, but the feeling it left behind remained. Heavy, oppressive, like the village itself had drawn in a breath and refused to release it. Minutes passed. Daniel cleared his throat. "What was that bell?" The old woman answered quietly. "It's a warning." Elias nodded slowly. "When the bell rings, it means something has left the forest." Daniel rubbed his temples. "You keep saying things like that," he muttered. "But no one is actually explaining anything." Elias sat down across from him. His eyes looked tired, far older than the rest of his face. "You won't understand everything tonight," he said. "But there are things you should know." Daniel leaned forward. "Good." Elias folded his hands. "First, you need to understand something about this place." He pointed upward. Daniel followed his gaze toward the ceiling, confused. "The sky," Elias said. Daniel frowned. "What about it?" Elias' voice lowered. "The sun does not rise here." Daniel stared at him. "That's impossible." Elias didn't react. "Look outside tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "You'll see." Daniel slept poorly. Elias had given him a small room upstairs, bare wooden floorboards, a narrow bed, and a single window completely sealed by thick planks. Even through the boards, faint gray light leaked into the room. Daniel lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling. The village remained silent. No voices. No footsteps. No animals. Just the occasional creak of wood as the old house settled against the cold mountain air. At some point, exhaustion finally dragged him into sleep. But the dreams were strange. He dreamed of the forest, tall trees swaying in unnatural wind, and something enormous moving between them. Not chasing him, not hunting, just watching, waiting. When Daniel woke, the first thing he did was check his watch. 7:12 a.m. He sat up immediately. Sunrise. He swung his legs off the bed and walked to the boarded window. Light still seeped through the cracks in the wood. The same dull gray light. Exactly the same as the night before. Daniel pressed his face close to the boards, trying to peek through the narrow gaps. Outside, the village looked identical. Same dim twilight. Same unmoving sky. No sunrise. No morning glow. Just endless gray. Daniel stepped back slowly. "No," he whispered. "That's not possible." He hurried downstairs. Elias sat at the table, sipping from a chipped mug. The old woman was stirring something in a pot over a small stove. Daniel pointed toward the window. "It's morning." Elias nodded. "Yes, but it's still dark." Elias took another sip. "It always is." Daniel paced the room. "This has to be some kind of weather system, thick cloud cover or—" Elias shook his head. "It's been like this for 32 years." Daniel stopped walking. 32. The old man nodded. The last sunrise happened in the autumn of 1994. Daniel laughed nervously. That's ridiculous. But even as he said the words, doubt crept into his voice. Because outside the window, the sky had not changed. Not even slightly. Daniel walked toward the door and unlocked one of the bolts. Elias watched him carefully. You shouldn't go outside alone. Daniel ignored him. The door opened with a low creak. Cold air poured into the house. Daniel stepped outside. The village looked exactly the same as the night before. Gray sky, muted light, empty streets. But now people moved between houses. Slowly, quietly, the villagers looked exhausted. Dark circles under their eyes. Their movements careful and deliberate, as if they were conserving energy for something worse that would come later. Daniel walked down the street. Several villagers glanced at him as he passed. Their expressions held a mixture of curiosity and pity. One man carrying a bundle of firewood paused beside him. You're the traveler. Daniel nodded. Apparently. The man studied him for a moment. You came through the road in the forest. Yeah. The man looked toward the mountains. That road doesn't appear often. Daniel crossed his arms. People keep saying things like that. The man shifted the wood on his shoulder. The mountain decides who finds it. Daniel rolled his eyes. That sounds like folklore. The man didn't smile. Everything here does. He walked away. Daniel continued down the street. At the far end of the village stood the church he had seen the night before. The leaning bell tower cast a long, crooked shadow across the dirt road. Daniel approached the building. The church doors were open. Inside, the air smelled of candle wax and damp stone. Rows of old wooden pews filled the room. But Daniel's attention went immediately to the windows. Every single one of them had been boarded shut from the inside. Even the stained glass. Thick wooden planks sealed every opening. He walked toward the altar. A large wooden cross hung behind it. But beneath the cross, carved into the wall, was something strange. A symbol. A circle surrounded by jagged lines. Almost like a sun. But cracked. Broken. Daniel frowned. Strange place for a church decoration. A voice answered behind him. It wasn't carved for decoration. Daniel turned. An elderly priest stood near the doorway. His robe looked worn with age. His eyes were heavy with quiet sorrow. What does it mean? Daniel asked. The priest stepped closer to the symbol. That, he said softly, is the last sunrise. Daniel studied the carving again. The jagged lines around the circle looked less like rays now, and more like fractures. What happened 32 years ago? Daniel asked. The priest's expression darkened. Something woke up. Daniel waited for him to continue. But the priest remained silent. Finally, Daniel sighed. Everyone here keeps speaking in riddles. The priest looked toward the church doors, toward the forest beyond the village. Then he said quietly, the sun did not abandon this village. Daniel frowned. Then what happened? The priest's voice dropped to a whisper. It was taken. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. Outside, a faint wind moved through the empty street. The church bell swayed slightly in the tower above them. The priest turned toward him. You should leave while you still can. Daniel laughed softly. I tried. The priest studied him carefully. Then I'm afraid, he said slowly. You arrived exactly when it needed you to. Daniel blinked. Needed me for what? But the priest had already turned away. And outside the church, The gray sky darkened just a little more. Chapter 4. The locals fear the woods after dusk. By what should have been midday, the sky over the village still had not changed. The same dull gray light hung above the mountains, casting long, lifeless shadows across the dirt streets. No warmth touched the ground. No color returned to the sky. Daniel Mercer stood outside the church for several minutes after the priest left. He kept staring upward, waiting for something, anything to shift. Clouds to move. Light to brighten. But nothing happened. It was like time itself had stalled above the village. The wind stirred softly between the buildings, carrying with it a strange scent. Cold pine, old wood, and something faintly metallic. Daniel turned toward the mountains surrounding the village. Tall, dark forests climbed the slopes on every side, forming a dense wall of trees that sealed the settlement inside the valley. The same forest the road had come through. The same forest that had swallowed the road behind him. Daniel squinted toward the trees. Even in the strange gray light, the woods looked darker than the rest of the valley. Not shadowed. Darker. As if the light itself refused to enter. A voice spoke behind him. You shouldn't stare at them too long. Daniel turned. A man stood near the church steps, carrying a rifle across his shoulder. He looked to be in his early 40s, with a thick beard and weathered face that suggested years spent outdoors. Daniel gestured toward the forest. Those woods. The man nodded. Especially those. Daniel folded his arms. I've heard about them already. Have you? Daniel studied him. You're a hunter. The man glanced down at the rifle. Used to be. Used to. The hunter gave a humorless smile. Until the forest started hunting back. Daniel chuckled softly. People here like their metaphors. The man didn't laugh. My name's Rowan, he said. Daniel. They shook hands. Rowan's grip was firm but cautious, like a man who had learned not to trust easily. Daniel nodded toward the trees again. So what exactly is so dangerous out there? Rowan stared at the forest for a long moment before answering. After dusk, he said quietly, nothing that goes into those woods comes back the same. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That sounds dramatic. Rowan shrugged. It's accurate. Daniel leaned against the church railing. Let me guess, wolves, bears. Rowan shook his head slowly. I used to hunt wolves in those mountains. He pointed toward the dark tree line. They left years ago. Why? Rowan's eyes remained fixed on the forest. Because something moved and that made them afraid. Daniel felt a faint chill along his arms. He forced a smile. You're serious? Rowan nodded. Dead serious. For a moment neither man spoke. The village remained quiet around them. People moved between buildings, carrying supplies, repairing fences, stacking firewood. Everyone worked quickly, purposefully, as if preparing for something inevitable. Daniel noticed something else. No one walked toward the forest. Not even close. The villagers kept a wide distance from the tree line, as though an invisible barrier surrounded it. Daniel pointed this out. Why does everyone stay away from the woods? Rowan gave him a tired look. You really don't know where you are, do you? Daniel shook his head. Nope. Rowan adjusted the rifle strap on his shoulder. The forest watches the village. Daniel laughed softly. That's poetic again. Rowan ignored the remark. And every night, he continued, it sends something down to check on us. Daniel's smile faded slightly. That thing we heard last night. Rowan nodded. Probably. Daniel leaned forward. You've seen it. Rowan hesitated. Then he answered. Once. What did it look like? Rowan's jaw tightened. That's the problem. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Rowan glanced around the village. Lowering his voice, he said, It didn't look like anything. Daniel blinked. That's not possible. Rowan pointed toward the forest again. The night I saw it, I was still hunting. It had been winter. Rowan had taken his rifle into the woods just before sunset, tracking a deer through the snow. The forest had been quiet that evening. Too quiet. But Rowan had ignored the feeling. Until he saw the tracks. They appeared suddenly in the snow beside his own footprints. Large. Deep. As if something extremely heavy had stepped there. But the strange thing was, they had not approached from anywhere. The prints simply appeared beside him. Rowan had followed them deeper into the trees. Curiosity overpowering caution. Then the forest went silent. Not the normal quiet of nature. A deeper silence. One where even the wind seemed afraid to move. Rowan remembered the moment clearly. He had turned around, and the thing had been standing behind him. Not 10 feet away. Daniel leaned closer. What did it look like? Rowan's voice dropped to a whisper. That's just it. He swallowed slowly. I couldn't see it. Daniel frowned. You just said it was standing there. It was. But the shape of it kept changing. Rowan's hands tightened slightly. Like looking at something through thick smoke. Daniel shifted uneasily. And then, Rowan looked toward the village street. And then it spoke. Daniel's stomach tightened. What did it say? Rowan's eyes darkened. It said my name. Daniel stared at him. You're serious? Rowan nodded once. Perfectly. Daniel exhaled slowly. So what happened? Rowan forced a thin smile. I ran. Daniel laughed quietly. Smart move. Rowan didn't smile back. I ran for nearly an hour. Daniel's laughter faded. And Rowan pointed toward the mountains. When I finally stopped, I was standing right outside the village again. Daniel blinked. That doesn't make sense. Rowan shrugged. The forest doesn't care about making sense. The wind shifted suddenly. Cold air swept down from the mountains. Rowan glanced toward the sky. The gray light had dimmed slightly. Daniel noticed it too. What time is it? Rowan checked a pocket watch. Late. Daniel frowned. Late afternoon. Rowan shook his head. No. His expression grew serious. Late enough. Daniel looked toward the forest again. The dark tree line seemed closer now. More oppressive. Almost like the woods had crept a few steps toward the village. Rowan began walking back toward the houses. You should head inside. Daniel followed him. Already. Rowan nodded. Dusk comes fast here. Daniel glanced upward again. But it's been dusk all day. Rowan stopped walking. He looked directly at Daniel. You haven't seen real dusk yet. Daniel felt a sudden unease. What happens when it gets darker? Rowan answered simply. That's when it comes down from the trees. A church bell rang faintly somewhere behind them. Just once. Rowan's expression changed instantly. He grabbed Daniel's arm. Inside now. Daniel looked toward the forest. Something moved between the trees. Slow. Massive. And heading toward the village. Chapter 5. Something walks the roads at night. The bell had barely finished echoing when the entire village moved. Doors slammed. Windows shuttered. Heavy bolts slid into place with urgent, practiced rhythm. Daniel had never seen people move so quickly without speaking. No shouting. No panic. Just quiet, desperate speed. Rowan pulled Daniel across the street toward a narrow house with faded blue paint peeling from its walls. "Inside," Rowan ordered. Daniel stumbled through the doorway just as Rowan slammed it shut behind them. 3 locks snapped into place. Then Rowan dragged a thick wooden beam across the doorframe. Daniel caught his breath. "You people really rehearse this?" Rowan ignored him. Instead, he walked to the nearest window and checked the boards carefully, pressing each plank with the flat of his hand. Outside, the sky had grown darker. Not night. Not yet. But the gray twilight had thickened into something heavier, almost oily. The lantern on the table flickered. Daniel leaned against the wall. "What exactly happens when that bell rings?" Rowan didn't answer immediately. He stood still, listening. The village had fallen silent again. Completely silent. Daniel realized he could hear his own breathing. And nothing else. Rowan spoke quietly. "It means it's on the road." Daniel crossed his arms. "You still haven't told me what it is." Rowan finally looked at him. "If I describe it, you'll think I'm lying." "Try me." Rowan hesitated. Then he said, "It's wrong." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That's the description." Rowan nodded slowly. "Everything about it is wrong." Daniel walked toward the window. "Wrong how?" Rowan grabbed his arm again. "Don't." Daniel sighed. "I'm not opening the boards." But Rowan didn't release him. "You shouldn't even stand there." Daniel studied the man's tense expression. "You're serious?" Rowan nodded. "Dead serious." Daniel reluctantly stepped back. "Fine, I'll play along." Rowan exhaled slowly. "Good." Minutes passed. No one spoke. The air inside the house felt thick, as though the walls themselves were holding tension. Then Daniel heard it. At first it sounded like wind. A faint scraping noise drifting through the street outside. Then it came again. Louder. Something dragging. Slow. Heavy. Daniel looked toward the door. Rowan had gone pale. The scraping continued. It moved along the dirt road outside the house. Dragging. Stopping. Dragging again. Daniel whispered, "That thing." Rowan nodded. Daniel felt a strange pull in his chest. Curiosity. Dangerous curiosity. He moved quietly toward the window again. Rowan grabbed his sleeve. "No." Daniel whispered back. "I just want to hear it." Rowan leaned closer. "You will." The sound grew louder. Closer. The dragging noise stopped directly outside the house. Daniel's heartbeat began to pound in his ears. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Then something tapped lightly against the door. Daniel froze. The knock was soft. Polite. 3 slow taps. Rowan whispered under his breath, "Don't answer." Daniel stared at the door. Another knock. This time slightly louder. Then a voice spoke. Clear. Familiar. "Daniel." Daniel's blood turned cold. It was his voice. Exactly his voice. The tone. The accent. Everything. The thing outside the door spoke again. "You dropped something." Daniel swallowed hard. Rowan's grip tightened. "Don't respond." The voice continued. "You left your car keys." Daniel's stomach twisted. He instinctively reached into his pocket. Empty. The thing outside the door dragged something across the wood. Metal scraped lightly. "Keys," Daniel whispered. "How?" Rowan shook his head violently. "Don't talk." Outside, the voice sighed. Then it spoke again. This time slightly different. Still Daniel's voice. But wrong. The rhythm was off. The tone too flat. "You should come outside." Daniel stared at the door. "I'm not falling for that." Silence. The dragging sound began again. Moving slowly along the street. Daniel exhaled slowly. "What the hell is that thing?" Rowan spoke quietly. "It learns." Daniel frowned. "Learns what?" "Voices." The scraping sound moved further away. Daniel walked to the window and pressed his ear against the boards. Rowan allowed it this time. Outside, the creature moved slowly down the road. Daniel heard its footsteps now. Not footsteps exactly. More like something extremely heavy shifting its weight. Then another sound. Soft whispers. Different voices. Men. Women. Children. All overlapping. Daniel felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. "Are those?" Rowan finished the sentence. "People it's heard before." Daniel backed away from the window. "That's impossible." Rowan shrugged. "So is a village without a sunrise." The whispers faded. The dragging sound disappeared down the street. For several minutes, neither man moved. Finally, Rowan stepped toward the door and carefully lifted one of the locks. Daniel blinked. "What are you doing?" Rowan listened. Nothing outside. He lifted the second lock. Sometimes it only passes through. The final lock clicked open. Rowan slowly cracked the door. Cold air spilled into the room. The street outside looked empty. Daniel stepped forward cautiously. The gray twilight had returned to its earlier dull glow. But something lay on the dirt road. Right outside the house. Daniel knelt down. A set of car keys. His car keys. Daniel picked them up slowly. His hand trembled. "How did it get these?" Rowan stared toward the forest. His voice was barely audible. "It walked past your car." Daniel followed his gaze. The tree line at the edge of the village looked darker now. Deeper. Like a wound in the landscape. Daniel stood slowly. What happens if someone answers the door? Rowan didn't look away from the forest. They stopped being someone. Daniel's stomach tightened. The village remained silent. But far beyond the houses, deep within the forest, something massive moved between the trees. And it was turning around. Coming back. Chapter 6. The church bell rings when it hunts. The bell rang again. Not a single echo this time. Just one deep metallic strike that rolled through the valley like a warning carved into the air. Daniel and Rowan both froze in the doorway. Rowan swore under his breath. "That's not good." Daniel's grip tightened around his car keys. "What does that mean?" Rowan didn't answer immediately. He stared toward the forest, eyes narrowing as if trying to read something hidden between the trees. Then he said quietly, "It's hunting." Daniel felt a cold pressure settle in his chest. "Hunting what?" Rowan turned toward him. "You." Daniel blinked. "Me. You're new." Rowan's voice had lost all humor now. New voices attracted. The wind shifted through the empty street, carrying faint whispers from the forest. Daniel strained to listen. At first it sounded like branches scraping together. But then the whispers became clearer. Voices. Dozens of them. Layered together. Some crying. some laughing, some calling names. Rowan grabbed Daniel's shoulder. Inside. But the street is empty. That's the problem. Rowan pulled him back into the house and slammed the door again. Lock slid back into place. Daniel's heart pounded. This is insane. Rowan turned down the lantern flame until the room dimmed to near darkness. Less light. Daniel looked confused. Why? Rowan answered in a whisper. It's easier for it to see light. Daniel stared at him. That thing can see through walls. Rowan shook his head. Not exactly. The whispers outside grew louder. Daniel heard something moving along the street again. Slow. Heavy. But this time, the dragging sound was different. More deliberate. Like something packing. Rowan spoke softly. Sometimes it searches. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Searches for what? Rowan didn't hesitate. The one it heard. Daniel's pulse quickened. You man me. Rowan nodded. Outside, something brushed against the wall of the house. The wooden boards creaked slightly under the pressure. Daniel instinctively stepped back. Jesus. Rowan raised a finger to his lips. Quiet. The whispers outside suddenly stopped. Dead silence swallowed the village again. Daniel realized something terrifying. The silence wasn't empty. It was listening. Then a voice came from outside. Not Daniel's voice this time. A woman's voice. Soft. Trembling. Rowan. Rowan closed his eyes. Daniel whispered. Who is that? Rowan's voice barely escaped his throat. My sister. The voice outside spoke again. Rowan, please, it's cold. Daniel looked toward the door. Rowan shook his head violently. She died 6 years ago. The voice outside began to cry. The sound was heartbreakingly real. Rowan, I can't see. Daniel's stomach twisted. That's cruel. Rowan clenched his fists. It doesn't understand cruelty. The voice continued. Please open the door. Daniel shifted uneasily. What if? Rowan grabbed his shirt. There is no what if. The crying stopped instantly. The voice changed. Still Rowan's sister. But wrong. Flat. Mechanical. Rowan. A pause. You remember how she screamed. Rowan's face drained of color. The walls trembled slightly as something enormous shifted outside the house. Daniel heard footsteps now. Actual footsteps. Slow. Measured. Circling the building. The floorboards creaked beneath their weight. Daniel whispered. How big is it? Rowan answered without looking up. Too big. The footsteps stopped near the back wall. Something heavy leaned against the house. Wood groaned under the pressure. Daniel held his breath. Then the whispers returned. Hundreds of voices. Overlapping. Mimicking conversations. Arguments. Screams. Laughter. Daniel covered his ears. What is that? Rowan whispered. Everything it's taken. The whispers suddenly aligned into a single voice. A child's voice. Small. Fragile. Is someone in there? Daniel felt a wave of nausea. The child's voice continued. I'm lost. Rowan remained perfectly still. The child spoke again. I can't find my parents. A scratching sound slid across the door. Tiny fingernails. Please let me in. Daniel's instincts screamed at him. Every human impulse urged him to open the door. To help. To save the child. Rowan's whisper cut through the moment. It's testing you. Daniel clenched his jaw. I know. The scratching continued. Soft. Desperate. Please. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. Minutes passed. Then the scratching stopped. The footsteps returned, moving away. Slowly. Gradually. Finally, the whispers faded into the distance. The creature retreated down the street. Daniel opened his eyes. The lantern flickered weakly on the table. His hands were shaking. Rowan walked toward the window and pressed his ear against the boards. After a moment he exhaled. It's leaving. Daniel sank into a chair. What the hell is that thing? Rowan turned back toward him. His voice sounded hollow. We don't know. Daniel laughed weakly. That's comforting. Rowan sat across from him. We only know what it does. Daniel looked up. And what's that? Rowan spoke slowly. It listens. Daniel frowned. For what? Rowan stared at him. For weakness. The wind moved through the village again. Outside, the gray sky had darkened slightly. Daniel rubbed his face. How long until morning? Rowan gave him a long look. Then he said quietly, Morning doesn't help here. Daniel felt the room grow colder. Why? Rowan stood and walked to the door. He unlocked one bolt and cracked it open slightly. The village street was empty again. But Rowan pointed toward the forest. Daniel stepped beside him. Something huge had moved between the trees. Branches bent. Shadows shifted. The creature was climbing back into the forest. But before it disappeared, it stopped. Even from the distance, Daniel could feel it turning. Watching the village. Watching him. Rowan whispered, It always comes back. Daniel followed his gaze. Deep in the forest darkness, two enormous shapes slowly opened. Not eyes, but something very close. And they were looking straight at him. Chapter 7. The old woman reveals the first sacrifice. Morning came again. Or at least what passed for morning in the village. The gray sky had not brightened. It had not darkened. It simply remained the same lifeless color as the day before, an endless twilight stretching across the mountains like a forgotten sunset. Daniel Mercer had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the scratching at the door again. The child's voice. The crying. The whispers layered inside the darkness. Rowan sat across the room cleaning his rifle slowly, methodically, the way soldiers cleaned weapons after battles they barely survived. Neither man spoke for a long time. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. That thing knew your sister's voice. Rowan didn't look up. It knows every voice it hears. Daniel leaned forward. How? Rowan slid a cartridge into the rifle chamber. We think it remembers. Daniel rubbed his face. That doesn't answer the question. Rowan's voice turned grim. Nothing here has answers. Daniel stood and walked toward the door. I'm going to talk to someone who actually explains things. Rowan didn't stop him this time. Go see Mara. Daniel paused. Who's Mara? Rowan nodded toward the street. The old woman who lives near the well. Daniel remembered her. The one whose hands trembled as she carried the lantern the night before. She knows the whole story, Rowan added quietly. Daniel opened the door and stepped outside. The village looked tired. That was the only way Daniel could describe it. The houses leaned slightly as if exhausted. The streets carried the weight of too many nights. Even the villagers themselves moved with a slow heaviness, like people who had spent decades bracing for the same disaster over and over again. Daniel walked down the dirt road. People watched him as he passed. Not suspicious, not hostile, just sad. Near the center of the village stood an old stone well. Beside it sat a small crooked house with a sagging roof. A woman sat on the front porch. Mara. Her white hair hung in thin strands around her face, and her eyes had the cloudy softness of someone who had seen far too much darkness. Daniel approached carefully. "You're Mara." She nodded without surprise. "You're the traveler." Daniel sat on the porch railing. "I've been told you know what's happening here." Mara smiled faintly. "Everyone knows." Daniel gestured toward the mountains. "Then someone should start explaining." Mara studied him for a long moment. "You heard it last night." Daniel nodded. "Yeah. And it spoke to you. Through the door." She sighed softly. "Then you're already part of the story." Daniel frowned. "I didn't sign up for that." Mara chuckled quietly. "No one ever does." Daniel leaned forward. "Rowan told me the sun stopped rising 32 years ago." Mara nodded. "That was the night the first sacrifice failed." Daniel blinked. "Sacrifice?" Her expression grew darker. "Yes." Daniel shifted uneasily. "You mean like some kind of ritual?" Myra looked toward the forest. Long before this village existed, the people who lived in these mountains worshipped something older than memory. Daniel sighed. "Great occult." "They didn't call it that." "What did they call it?" Myra's voice dropped. "The Keeper of the Night." Daniel rolled his eyes slightly. "That sounds dramatic." Myra pointed toward the forest. "It lived there long before humans arrived." Daniel crossed his arms. "And they worshipped it. They feared it." Daniel frowned. "So they sacrificed people to it." Myra nodded slowly. "Every generation." Daniel stared at her. "That's insane." "They believed the creature protected the mountains." Daniel gestured around the valley. "Protected them from what?" Mara met his eyes. "Everything else." Daniel exhaled. "So what happened 32 years ago?" Mara's gaze drifted toward the church. "The ritual changed." Daniel waited. The villagers decided they were tired of living in fear. Daniel nodded. "Sounds reasonable." "They tried to end the sacrifices." Daniel leaned forward. "And?" Mara's voice trembled slightly. "They tried to kill it." Daniel blinked. "That must have gone badly." Mara nodded. "Very badly." The wind rustled through the village street. The well's old pulley creaked softly. Daniel felt a chill crawl along his arms. "What did they do?" Mara looked back at him. "They set a trap in the forest." Daniel listened carefully. "They brought weapons, fire, explosives." Daniel whistled softly. "Ambitious." "They lured the creature into a clearing." "And?" Mara closed her eyes briefly. For a moment, they thought they succeeded. Daniel leaned closer. "But they didn't." "No." Her voice barely carried across the porch. "They wounded it." Daniel's stomach tightened. "What happened next?" Mara pointed toward the sky. The sun disappeared. Daniel stared upward instinctively. The gray sky remained unchanged. "Why?" Mara answered quietly. "Because the creature feeds on darkness." Daniel felt the words sink slowly into his chest. "And daylight keeps it weak." Mara nodded. "So when they wounded it." Daniel finished the thought. "It took the sun." Mara nodded again. "Pulled the valley into endless twilight." Daniel looked toward the forest. The tree line seemed darker now. more alive somehow. So the sacrifices stopped. Mara shook her head slowly. No. Daniel frowned. They became worse. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What do you mean? Mara's voice cracked slightly. Before, the villagers chose who would be offered. Daniel swallowed. And now? Mara pointed toward the village. Now it chooses. Daniel felt the weight of her words settle heavily in the air. The wind shifted. A distant sound came from the forest. Branches snapping. Low. Heavy. Mara's eyes followed the sound. It's been restless since you arrived. Daniel felt a chill. Why me? Mara studied him carefully. Because the creature remembers something. Daniel frowned. What? Mara leaned closer. The night they tried to kill it. Daniel waited. One man escaped the forest. Daniel blinked. And Mara's eyes darkened. He had your face. Daniel's heart skipped. That's impossible. Mara looked toward the mountains again. In this village, she whispered slowly, nothing is impossible anymore. Deep in the forest, something enormous shifted in the trees. And for the first time since Daniel arrived, the creature began moving toward the village in daylight. Chapter 8. The traveler sees what lives in the dark. The first scream came from the far end of the village. It cut through the gray air like a knife. Daniel and Mara both turned toward the sound. Across the dirt road, villagers were already moving, dropping tools, abandoning carts, rushing toward their homes with sudden urgency. Daniel felt the same tension he had witnessed the night before. But this time, it was happening during the day. Rowan appeared at the corner of the street, running. He reached Daniel and grabbed his arm. You need to get inside. Daniel pointed toward the forest. It's still daylight. Rowan's expression was grim. That doesn't matter anymore. Another scream echoed through the village. Closer. Daniel turned toward the mountains. Something enormous was moving between the trees. Even from this distance, the forest reacted to it. Branches bent. Whole sections of pine shifted unnaturally, as if something massive was forcing its way downhill. Daniel felt his breath catch. That's it. Rowan nodded. Yeah. Daniel squinted. The thing was still partially hidden by the forest, but he could see the shape of movement. Or rather, the absence of shape. Something darker than the trees themselves. Something that bent the gray light around it. The creature reached the edge of the forest and stepped into the valley. Daniel's stomach dropped. For a moment, his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. It wasn't a body. Not really. It looked more like a wound in the air. A shifting mass of darkness that constantly changed form. Sometimes tall and narrow. Sometimes wide and crawling. Like smoke trying to imitate something alive. Rowan spoke quietly. That's the closest anyone's seen it in years. Daniel whispered. It's huge. The creature moved slowly toward the village. Each step distorted the air around it. Where its shadow passed, the ground turned black and lifeless. Grass wilted instantly. The gray light above seemed to dim slightly as it moved forward. Villagers were already barricading their homes. Doors slammed. Windows shuttered. The same ritual as nightfall, but faster. More desperate. Daniel stood frozen. He couldn't look away. The creature stopped halfway between the forest and the village. Its shape expanded suddenly. Dark tendrils stretched outward like enormous fingers touching the ground. Rowan whispered. It's searching. Daniel's throat felt dry. For what? Rowan didn't answer. Instead, he stared directly at Daniel. The creature shifted again. Then it turned, slowly, directly toward Daniel. The air seemed to collapse inward. Daniel felt pressure in his ears. The sound of the village faded into a dull hum. All he could hear was his own heartbeat. The creature leaned forward slightly. Not walking, observing. And for the first time, Daniel realized something terrifying. It wasn't blind. Where its face should have been, the darkness thinned slightly. Two enormous hollows opened within the shifting shadow. Not eyes, but something very close. And they were locked on him. Rowan swore. "It found you," Daniel whispered. "How?" The creature moved again. One slow step closer to the village. The ground trembled faintly. The pressure in the air intensified. Daniel suddenly felt something inside his mind. A whisper, not a voice. More like a thought that wasn't his. Familiar, ancient, hungry. Images flooded his vision. The forest, the clearing, firelight, people screaming, weapons exploding. Daniel staggered. "What?" Rowan grabbed him. "What's happening?" Daniel clutched his head. "I'm seeing something." The images grew clearer. 32 years earlier. Villagers standing in a ring inside the forest. Torches burning. A young man standing at the center. Daniel's breath caught. The man looked exactly like him. Same face. Same eyes. Same terrified expression. The villagers pushed the man forward toward the darkness in the trees. A sacrifice. But something went wrong. The man broke free. Ran. The creature rose from the forest. Massive. Unimaginable. And the sky went dark. Daniel gasped and collapsed to his knees. The vision vanished. The creature still stood in the valley. Watching him. Rowan knelt beside him. "What did you see?" Daniel looked up at the monster. His voice trembled. "That man." Rowan frowned. "What man?" Daniel swallowed. "The sacrifice." Rowan's expression slowly changed. "You saw the ritual." Daniel nodded weakly. "He escaped." Rowan stared at him. Only one man survived that night. Daniel looked toward the forest again. The creature had stopped moving. Still watching. Still waiting. Rowan spoke slowly. His name was Daniel Mercer. Daniel felt his stomach drop. "That's impossible." Rowan shook his head. "It's the same name." Daniel whispered. "But that was 32 years ago." Rowan nodded grimly. "Exactly." The creature took another step forward. The pressure in the air intensified. Daniel suddenly understood something terrible. The visions. The connection. The creature's attention. He wasn't just another traveler. The creature remembered him. Or something that looked exactly like him. Daniel whispered. "It thinks I'm him." Rowan stared at the approaching darkness. "That might be worse." Daniel struggled to stand. "What do you mean?" Rowan's voice dropped. The last sacrifice escaped. Daniel felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. "And now," Rowan finished the sentence, "it's come to finish what it started." The creature moved again. Closer. The ground trembled under its weight. Behind Daniel, the villagers watched from their barricaded homes. Silent. Waiting. The ancient thing in the valley leaned forward. And this time, it began walking directly toward him. Chapter 9. The village was built to contain it. The creature stopped just outside the village. Daniel Mercer could feel the air bending around it, like gravity itself had begun to warp in its presence. The gray twilight dimmed further, and the wind that normally crept through the valley had vanished completely. It was as if the entire world had paused to watch what happened next. Rowan stood beside Daniel, rifle in his hands, though both men knew the weapon was useless. "You shouldn't still be out here," Rowan whispered. Daniel couldn't take his eyes off the creature. "I don't think it matters anymore." The thing moved again. Not forward this time. Sideways. Slowly circling the outer edge of the village like a predator studying a cage. Rowan noticed it too. His brow tightened. "That's strange." Daniel swallowed. "What?" Rowan gestured toward the houses. "It's not crossing the line." Daniel blinked. "What line?" Rowan pointed toward the dirt road that marked the outer boundary of the village. "You see that marker stone?" Daniel followed his finger. Near the edge of the road sat a small weathered rock carved with faint symbols, strange circular patterns similar to the one Daniel had seen inside the church. The creature approached the stone and stopped. The massive shadow recoiled slightly, like something invisible had pushed it back. Daniel's voice trembled. "It can't come closer." Rowan nodded slowly. "For now." Daniel looked around the village. More stones sat along the outskirts, half buried in the dirt, easy to miss unless someone knew where to look. Each one carved with the same fractured sun symbol. Daniel felt realization creeping into his thoughts. "The village," Rowan finished it, "is the cage." Daniel stared at him. "You mean the whole town?" Rowan nodded. "The stones were placed here long ago." Daniel glanced toward the forest. "To keep it trapped." Rowan's expression darkened. "To keep it contained." Daniel frowned. "That's the same thing." Rowan shook his head slowly. "No." Daniel felt the difference immediately. "Contained means it's already inside." Rowan nodded. "Exactly." The creature continued circling the outer boundary. Its shifting form pressed against the invisible barrier surrounding the village. Where the darkness touched the boundary stones, the air shimmered faintly, like heat above asphalt. Daniel turned toward Rowan. "So the villagers didn't build this place to live here." Rowan's voice grew quieter. "They built it to guard the prison." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "And anyone who lives here is part of the lock." Daniel looked back at the creature. It was still watching him. The hollows within the darkness, those almost eyes, never left his face. Rowan spoke carefully. "When the sacrifices were still happening, the creature stayed deep in the forest." Daniel nodded. "But when they tried to kill it," Rowan finished the thought, "it broke free." Daniel glanced at the stones again. "So the villagers trapped it in the valley." Rowan nodded. "And sealed the borders." Daniel frowned. "That doesn't explain why the sun disappeared." Rowan sighed. "The creature feeds on darkness." Daniel remembered Mara's words. "And daylight weakens it." Rowan nodded. "So when it was wounded." Daniel looked up at the gray sky. "It pulled the valley into permanent twilight." Rowan studied the creature carefully. "Dark enough to survive." Daniel's voice dropped. "But not strong enough to escape." Rowan nodded. "Exactly." The creature stopped circling. It turned toward Daniel again and began walking slowly along the invisible boundary. Matching his position, Daniel took a step backward. The creature mirrored the movement. Another step. It followed. Rowan noticed it immediately. It's tracking you. Daniel's throat tightened. That's what it did 32 years ago. Rowan nodded grimly. The man who escaped the sacrifice. Daniel whispered. My face. Rowan's eyes narrowed. It thinks you're him. Daniel felt the weight of that truth pressing into his chest. But I'm not. Rowan didn't respond. Daniel turned toward him. You believe that, right? Rowan hesitated. Then he spoke carefully. Maybe. Daniel's stomach twisted. What does that mean? Rowan looked back at the creature. The man who escaped vanished into the mountains. Daniel waited. They never found his body. Daniel's voice grew tight. So, Rowan met his eyes. 32 years is a long time. Daniel's heart skipped. You're not suggesting. I'm suggesting, Rowan interrupted quietly, that the creature remembers something. Daniel looked toward the darkness again. The creature had stopped moving. It stood directly across the boundary stone from him. Silent. Waiting. Daniel suddenly understood something terrible. It's not trying to kill me. Rowan frowned. What? Daniel's voice shook. It's waiting. For what? Daniel pointed toward the stone barrier. For me to cross. Rowan's expression hardened. That would break the seal. Daniel nodded slowly. If I leave the village. Rowan finished the sentence. It can follow. Daniel felt his chest tighten. The entire valley suddenly felt smaller. More suffocating. So that's why no one leaves. Rowan nodded. Anyone who enters the village becomes part of the prison. Daniel laughed weakly. You're telling me I'm stuck here forever. Rowan didn't answer. Daniel stared at the creature again. Its massive shape slowly leaned closer to the barrier. The almost eyes flickered within the darkness. Watching. Studying. Waiting. Then something strange happened. The creature spoke. Not with a voice, but inside Daniel's mind. A whisper older than the mountains themselves. Come back. Daniel staggered slightly. Rowan grabbed him. What is it? Daniel's face had gone pale. It just talked to me. Rowan's eyes widened. What did it say? Daniel stared at the creature. The darkness pulsed faintly. Like a heartbeat. It thinks I belong to it. Rowan whispered a single word. Sacrifice. Daniel felt cold realization spread through him. The original sacrifice had escaped. The creature had waited 32 years. And now, something that looked exactly like that man had walked straight back into its prison. Daniel took a slow step backward from the boundary. The creature remained still, watching him retreat. Rowan spoke quietly. There's only one way this ends. Daniel looked at him. How? Rowan nodded toward the church. The ritual. Daniel's stomach dropped. You mean sacrifice me? Rowan didn't look away from the creature. I mean finishing what the villagers started. Behind them, the church bell began to move. Slowly. Back and forth. As if something inside the tower had begun ringing it again. And this time, the creature didn't retreat from the sound. It smiled. Or at least, the darkness inside it shifted in a way that looked terrifyingly close. Chapter 10. The sun was never meant to return. The church bell began ringing again. Not once, not twice, but over and over, each strike echoing through the valley like a heartbeat growing louder and louder. Daniel Mercer stood frozen in the dirt road, while the creature waited beyond the boundary stones. The bell's sound seemed to shake the village itself. Doors opened. Villagers stepped outside slowly. Not with panic this time. With resignation. Daniel noticed something in their faces he hadn't seen before. Acceptance. Rowan stood beside him, gripping the rifle loosely now. "It's time," Rowan said quietly. Daniel looked at him. "Time for what?" Rowan nodded toward the church. "To finish the ritual." Daniel laughed nervously. "You keep saying that like it's normal." Rowan didn't smile. "It used to be." The bell continued ringing. Villagers gathered along the road, forming a silent path leading toward the church steps. Mara stood among them, her fragile frame leaning on a wooden cane. Her cloudy eyes met Daniel's. "This is how it was always meant to end," she said gently. Daniel felt anger rise in his chest. "So that's it." He gestured toward the creature beyond the boundary. "You're just going to feed me to that thing." Mara shook her head slowly. "No." Daniel blinked. "Then what?" Rowan answered. "We're going to seal it again." Daniel frowned. "It's already trapped." Rowan nodded. "But the seal is failing." Daniel looked at the boundary stones again. They hummed faintly with energy now, vibrating in response to the creature's presence. "Why me?" Daniel demanded. Mara stepped forward. "Because it remembers you." Daniel shook his head. "I'm not that man." "No," Mara said softly. "But something in you is." Daniel stared at her. "What does that mean?" Mara pointed toward the church. "The ritual doesn't require the same man." Daniel felt a chill. "Just someone the creature recognizes." Rowan spoke quietly. "A reflection." Daniel looked toward the creature. The massive shadow stood perfectly still. Watching. Waiting. He suddenly remembered the vision he had seen earlier. The man running through the forest 32 years ago. The man with his face. "What happened to him?" Daniel asked. Mara's voice dropped. "He ran." Daniel nodded slowly. "And the creature followed." Rowan finished the thought. "But it never caught him." Daniel looked back toward the forest. "Then why is it still here?" Mara answered softly. "Because the ritual was never completed." Daniel understood then. The creature wasn't just hunting. It was waiting for something unfinished. Something owed. Daniel looked back at Rowan. "What exactly does this ritual do?" Rowan glanced at the sky. "It brings the sun back." Daniel blinked. "That's possible." Rowan nodded. "For a moment." Daniel frowned. "For a moment." Mara spoke again. "The sunlight weakens it." Daniel's chest tightened. "And then?" Rowan answered quietly. "Then the prison resets." Daniel stared at him. "With me inside." Rowan didn't deny it. The bell continued ringing. The villagers waited silently along the path. The creature beyond the boundary shifted slightly. Its massive form leaned closer to the invisible barrier. Daniel felt its attention pressing into his mind. That ancient whisper returned. "Come back." Daniel exhaled slowly. "So I walk into the church." Rowan nodded. "And finish the sacrifice." Daniel laughed weakly. "You people really have terrible traditions." Mara stepped closer. "Daniel." He looked at her. "You can refuse." Daniel glanced toward the forest. The creature waited patiently. "But if I leave the village?" Rowan finished the sentence. "It leaves with you." Daniel felt the weight of the entire valley pressing into his shoulders. He looked at the villagers. Men, women, children. 32 years trapped beneath a sky that never changed. All of them waiting. For him. Daniel sighed. "Wells," he muttered. "That's unfortunate." Rowan frowned slightly. "What is?" Daniel shrugged. "I was hoping this trip would be relaxing." A few villagers actually laughed quietly. Dark humor. The only kind that survived in a place like this. Daniel began walking toward the church. The crowd parted silently. The bell grew louder with each step. Inside the church, the air felt colder than outside. Candles lined the altar, and carved into the floor beneath them was the same cracked sun symbol. Rowan followed him inside. "So what happens now?" Daniel asked. Rowan pointed toward the center of the symbol. "You stand there." Daniel stepped into the circle. The moment his foot touched the carving, the bell stopped. Silence filled the church. Outside, the creature stirred. The candles flickered violently. Daniel felt warmth suddenly flood the air. A strange golden glow appeared above the altar. At first it looked like a faint spark. Then it grew brighter. Stronger. Daniel looked up. For the first time since he arrived, sunlight touched the village. Real sunlight. Brilliant. Blinding. Outside, the creature screamed. A sound like mountains tearing apart. The darkness recoiled violently from the light. Its massive form twisted and collapsed inward. Daniel felt the ground tremble beneath him. The villagers outside gasped as the gray sky split open for a single moment. Blue. Bright. Alive. Daniel smiled faintly. "Worth it," he whispered. The light grew stronger. Rowan watched from the doorway. The sunlight intensified until the entire church glowed with warmth. And then it vanished. The sky sealed again. The twilight returned. But the creature was gone. Completely gone. Daniel stood alone in the center of the symbol. The air had gone cold again. Rowan stepped forward slowly. "It worked." Daniel nodded weakly. He suddenly felt very tired. Rowan looked toward the doorway. Outside, the villagers were staring upward. The gray sky remained. But something had changed. A faint glow now touched the horizon. The smallest hint of dawn. Rowan turned back toward Daniel. "Looks like the sun remembered us." Daniel smiled. "That's good." Rowan frowned. "You should come see it." But Daniel didn't move. Rowan stepped closer. "Daniel." Daniel's smile faded slightly. His shadow stretched across the church floor. Except it wasn't moving with him. Rowan's blood ran cold. The shadow slowly peeled away from Daniel's feet. Rising. Growing taller. Darker. Daniel looked down at it. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "I don't think it's gone." The shadow continued growing, spreading across the church walls. Rowan backed away slowly. "Daniel." Daniel looked toward him. And for a moment, his eyes were filled with darkness. "The prison didn't close," Daniel whispered. Outside, the faint glow of dawn faded again. The gray twilight swallowed the valley. And somewhere deep inside the village, something new began to wake.
Closing chapter.
Some towns disappear from maps because they are abandoned. Others disappear because they are hiding something. The traveler thought he had discovered a forgotten village lost in the mountains, but the truth was far worse. The village wasn't forgotten. It was sacrificed. A place where people live their entire lives without sunlight, because they are guarding something the world must never see. And now the traveler understands the final rule of the village. No one leaves. Because if even one person escapes, the darkness escapes with them. So tonight, before you turn off the lights, remember this. Some places are not missing from maps by accident. They are missing to protect the rest of us. And if you ever find a road that leads somewhere that shouldn't exist, turn around before the sun forgets you too.